Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that takes complex topics and, well, dives deep, aiming to give you clear insights and maybe save you some reading time. Today we're jumping into a really ancient text, the very first chapter of the book of Nehemiah, using the MCS Nehemiah, a verse-by-verse study, as our guide. Our mission really is to get to know this guy, Nehemiah, explore how he reacts, like right in the moment, to some truly awful news, and then unpack his first prayer, which is just packed with lessons. And you might actually be surprised how relevant this ancient story feels. It offers some pretty deep insights into leadership, faith, and how you might face your own big challenges.
Absolutely. It's fascinating how much practical wisdom, about resilience and even spiritual practice we can pull from just these opening verses. It really sets the tone for everything that follows.
Okay, so let's set the scene then. Who was this Nehemiah figure? What was his role? Because it wasn't exactly ordinary, was it?
No, not at all. So Nehemiah was a Jew, part of the generation living in exile after Jerusalem had fallen. But here's the interesting part. He wasn't just, out in the provinces somewhere. He had this incredibly high-ranking position in the Persian Empire.
Which was?
He was the personal cupbearer to King Artaxerxes.
The cupbearer. Now, that sounds maybe like just pouring wine, but it was way more significant than that, right? What did that actually mean in terms of power or access?
Oh, hugely significant. Way more than just serving drinks. The cupbearer was like one of the king's absolute closest confidants. Yes, the main job was tasting food and drink to prevent poisoning, so immense trust was required.
Right, you have to be totally loyal.
Totally. But because of that closeness, they heard everything. Court secrets, political discussions, they often acted as advisors. They had the king's ear in a way almost no one else did.
Okay.
And it's also key to understand he was friends with Ezra the priest, sure, but Nehemiah himself was what we'd call a layman.
Meaning not part of the religious hierarchy.
Exactly. Not from the priestly line, not a designated religious leader, just in that sense, an ordinary citizen, albeit one in an extraordinary position. And that becomes really important later.
And this book, the Book of Nehemiah, what's the big picture story it tells?
It's fundamentally about rebuilding. First, the physical rebuilding of Jerusalem's ruined walls, a massive undertaking for a people who felt defeated. And second, it's about the spiritual and community rebuilding the return of God's people, rediscovering who they were meant to be.
Okay, so that brings us right to the start of the action, Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. What happens? What's the spark that lights this fire?
Right. Nehemiah himself tells us. He says, Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, and gives us a specific time and place. It was in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the capital.
Shushan, that was a major Persian capital, right? Modern Iran, basically.
That's it. So he's there, far from his homeland, and a group arrives from Judah. One of them is Hanani, who the text calls his kinsman, maybe his brother or close relative.
Okay, so family connection, they've made this long journey. What's the first thing Nehemiah wants to know?
His heart immediately goes to his people. He asks about the remnant of Judeans who had escaped the exile and about Jerusalem. You can just feel his anxiety, his hope for good news.
But he doesn't get good news, does he? What's the report?
No, it's grim, they tell him straight. The remnant of the exile left there in the province are in great distress and are held in contempt. The wall of Jerusalem is in ruins, and its gates have been completely burned up.
Wow, in ruins and gates burned up. That paints a really bleak picture. And for a city back then, having no walls or gates, that wasn't just inconvenient. It meant something much deeper, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely crucial point. Walls and gates weren't just for defense, though they were vital for that. They were symbols. Symbols of security, yes, but also identity, honor, stability.
So a city without them was?
Defenseless, obviously, but also shameful. It was like wearing a sign saying defeated, vulnerable, contemptible. Think about it. No secure trade, no real community order, just constant fear and the visible reminder of past trauma and present weakness. It was a psychological blow as much as a physical one.
Okay, that really puts the weight on that news. So here's Nehemiah living in relative comfort and privilege in the palace. How does he take this catastrophic report? This is in verse 4, and it's quite striking.
It really is. His reaction is instantaneous and profoundly emotional. The text says, on hearing this answer, I sat down and wept. He mourned for several days, fasting and praying before the God of heaven.
He sat down and wept. Didn't draft a memo, didn't call a meeting. He grieved.
Exactly. It wasn't just a quick, oh, that's terrible. It was deep physical grief. Sitting, weeping, mourning, fasting, praying for days. It completely overwhelmed him.
That initial response, that deep lament before any action, what's the significance there? Because our modern instinct might be to jump into problem-solving mode immediately.
That's maybe one of the biggest takeaways right here. His first move isn't strategic, it's spiritual. It's about deeply identifying with the suffering of his people. It's this profound empathy. This grief isn't passive resignation, it's like an active spiritual posture. It kind of suggests that real change, real leadership, often starts not with a plan, but with feeling the weight of the brokenness. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? When we see things falling apart, maybe values eroding in our own communities, or nations turning away from faith, do we have that kind of reaction? Does it hit us that hard?
That's a challenging thought. Okay, so this intense period leads him into prayer.
Yeah.
And this prayer in verses 5 through 11, it's often held up as a model. Let's dive into that. What stands out right away in verses 5 to 7?
Well, the first thing is how it starts. He doesn't launch into the problems. He begins by focusing entirely on God's character. He prays, "Please, Adonai, God of heaven, you great and fearsome God who keeps his covenant and extends grace to those who love him and observe his mitzvot."
So, starting with who God is, great, fearsome, covenant-keeping, gracious. Not with the crisis itself. That feels different from how maybe we often pray when things are bad.
It is different. It's like he's resetting his own focus first. Before anything else, remind yourself who you're talking to. This immense, faithful, powerful God.
Yeah.
It anchors him, you see. It stops the panic by focusing on the unchanging reality of God.
Okay, so acknowledging God first, then what?
Then he asks for God's attention, basically. "Let your ear now be attentive and your eyes be open. Listen to the prayer of your servant." Day and night, he says he's praying for the people. And then comes the really hard part, confession.
Oh.
He confesses the sins of the people of Israel. But, and this is crucial, he doesn't point fingers. He says, "Yes, I and my father's house have sinned. We have deeply offended you. We haven't observed the mitzvot, laws or rulings you ordered your servant Moshe."
Okay, let's pause there. Mitzvah, can you just quickly clarify what that means here?
Sure. Mitzvot is the Hebrew word for commandments, essentially. The divine instructions God gave through Moses. They covered everything: worship, ethics, daily life. So Nehemiah is saying, we, as a people, including me and my family, have failed to live by your standards.
And he includes himself right in there.
Yeah.
No sense of being separate or above it because of his position.
None at all. It's incredibly humble. He takes ownership of the collective failure. That's a powerful part of this prayer model.
So acknowledge God, ask for attention, confess sin, including your own part. But he doesn't just stay there in confession, right? How does the prayer shift towards hope? I'm thinking verses 8 and 9.
Right. This is the pivot. He moves from their failure to God's faithfulness. He essentially says to God, "Remember, please, the word you gave through your servant Moshe." He actually reminds God of his own promise.
What promise was that?
The promise that said, basically, if you break faith, I'll scatter you, which had happened. But, and this is the key part Nehemiah focuses on, if you return to me, observe my mitzvot, and obey them, then even if your scattered ones are in the most distant part of heaven, nevertheless, I will collect them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen for bearing my name.
Okay. So he's holding on to that promise of restoration. Even though things look terrible right now, he's saying, God, you promised that if we return to you, you'd bring us back.
Exactly. That's the anchor of hope. He knows God is a promise keeper. So even with the walls down and the people in distress, this covenant promise gives him a solid foundation to believe things can change, that God can restore Jerusalem and his people. He's appealing directly to God's character and his word.
That makes sense. It's not just wishful thinking. It's based on a prior commitment. So how does he wrap up this prayer in verses 10 and 11? What's the final ask, and what's maybe surprising about it?
He continues by reminding God, "Now these are your servants, your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and strong hand," kind of like saying, these are your people you invested so much in. Then he asks again for God's ear, not just for his own prayer, but for all the servants who take joy in fearing your name.
And then comes the specific request.
Yes, a very specific, very humble request. "Please let your servant succeed today and win this man's compassion." And then he adds that little note, "I was the king's personal attendant. The man is King Artaxerxes."
So after all that focus on God's character, confession, and promises, his only specific ask is success today and favor with the king.
Pretty much. That's what's so striking. You look at the whole prayer facing this massive crisis, and you realize how little time he actually spends asking God for things.
Yeah.
Most of it is worship, acknowledging God, confession, reminding God of promises. He's not giving God a detailed plan or a list of demands. He just asks for favor with the one person who holds the political key.
That implies a huge amount of trust, doesn't it? Trust that if he gets that favor, God will handle the rest.
Exactly. It suggests that maybe the most important work in prayer during hard times is aligning our own hearts with God, confessing our part, remembering his faithfulness, and then simply asking for the next step, trusting him with the bigger picture. It's a pattern we could probably learn a lot from.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
So bringing this all together for someone listening today, what are the big takeaways? What can Nehemiah's very first steps teach us when we're facing something that feels overwhelming?
Well, first, I think, is the sheer power of starting with God, that humble, worship-focused prayer, acknowledging who he is before anything else, leaning on promises.
And his reaction to the bad news,
Hmm.
the morning fasting, praying first.
Yes, that spiritual discipline before action, allowing yourself to feel the grief, the weight of the situation, but channeling it into prayer, not just panic or, immediate frantic activity. It shows leadership starts with empathy and taking responsibility.
Right. It's about the how of your response, emotionally and spiritually, maybe even more than the what of your immediate actions. Finding strength in those promises before you see any solution.
Precisely. And think about how that applies now. When we see brokenness in our lives, our families, our communities, maybe even globally, things that feel just too big, too ruined, Nehemiah's example is powerful.
Especially as a layman, as you said. Not necessarily the person everyone expected to fix it.
Exactly. He shows that you don't have to be the designated leader. When you see those ruined walls, whatever they represent for you, maybe the most effective first step isn't a 5-point plan. Maybe it's that inward turn of grief and confession and that upward turn of worship and clinging to promises, trusting that the path forward will emerge from that place.
That was a really rich deep dive into just one chapter. We've looked at Nehemiah, this unique figure, the terrible news he got, his really profound reaction, and this incredible prayer that set everything else in motion.
Mm-hmm. And maybe a final thought for you to chew on. Nehemiah's journey starts with weeping and prayer over physical ruins. What are the ruined walls in your world right now? Things that seem broken, maybe beyond repair. And what could Nehemiah's first response, that deep grief, followed by worship, focusing on God's character and promises, teach you about taking that crucial first step toward rebuilding?
Something definitely worth reflecting on. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. We hope digging into this ancient story offered some fresh perspective for today. Join us next time for another deep dive into fascinating sources.